You remember the smell before you remember anything else? Balsa. Fresh cut balsa wood, which is its own particular thing. Lighter than pine, softer than cedar, carrying a faint sweetness that has no precise analog in the adult world, but that the part of your brain responsible for memory has filed away completely, permanently. You remember the sound of the hobby shop on a Saturday morning, the bell above the door, the glass cases with the engines locked inside them, the rolls of monocoat covering film in colors that seemed almost impossibly vivid. Chrome yellow, signal red, transparent blue, hanging from the ceiling like ceremonial banners. You remember the man behind the counter who knew your name, knew what you were building, knew whether the kit you'd been saving for was finally in stock. You remembered the weight of a flat box under your arm on the way home, the precise ritual of spreading the contents across the kitchen table, the instruction manual that unfolded like a map to somewhere you hadn't been yet. And you remember the first time a model you'd built with your own hands that you'd cut and sanded and pinned and glued and covered and balanced and tuned, lifted off a grass field in central Illinois or central Ohio or anywhere in the country where a few acres of mown grass and a row of frequency pennants marked the boundary between the ordinary world and something else. The model climbed and banked and caught the light. The way the sound of the engine, a minus size 2-stroke on 15% nitro, turning an APC 11x7 propeller at somewhere near 12,000 RPM, carried across the field like a declaration. Great Plains Model Manufacturing was founded in Champaign, Illinois, in 1982. 2018, it was gone, absorbed into a bankruptcy proceeding that erased $175 million in annual revenue, threatened 332 jobs in a mid-sized Midwestern city, and scattered the intellectual property of the American hobby industry across multiple acquisition proceedings like so many pieces of a disassembled kit that nobody was going to build. This is the story of what happened in those 36 years. About what it cost to build a model airplane from a flat box of balsa sheets and spruce sticks, and about what a generation lost when someone decided that the building part was no longer necessary. The question is not simply whether Great Plains was killed. The question is what the world looked like when it was alive, and what it looks like now, and whether the difference matters. The answer is complicated and quiet and carries no obvious resolution. It is worth sitting with, especially for the people who spent their Saturday mornings at the table with a building board and a plan that unrolled to 4 feet across the kitchen floor. The city of Champaign, Illinois sits in the center of a state that is itself the center of something larger. The particular American culture of the Midwest that does not advertise itself, does not produce many movies about its own character, and has always been more comfortable making things than talking about what it makes. Champaign is a university town, home to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, which in 1982 was already one of the premier engineering schools in the country. The surrounding region was flat farmland, corn and soybeans stretching to every visible horizon, interrupted by grain elevators and small towns, and the occasional industrial park where someone had decided that this patch of Illinois flatness was the right place to manufacture something. The Midwest in 1982 was not doing well. The recession that had begun in 1980 had hit manufacturing communities hard. The great industrial belt from Pittsburgh through Detroit, through Chicago was shedding jobs at a rate that felt, to the people living inside it, like a slow hemorrhage. In the RC hobby world specifically, Japanese companies OS Engines, Futaba, High-Tech, Kyosho had established significant American market presence through the 1970s, and were in 1982 continuing to expand. Into this environment, a mechanical engineer named Don Anderson founded Great Plains Model Distributors in 1972 10 years before the manufacturing arm that would bear the name most hobbyists remember. Anderson was from the beginning interested in a specific problem. The model aircraft kits available to American RC pilots in the early 1970s were, by any serious manufacturing standard, poorly made. The wood was inconsistently cut. The parts fit was approximate. The instruction manuals were ambiguous in ways that produced crashes rather than competence. A builder who could build could not always count on the kit to reward the effort. This problem was not merely commercial. It was cultural. A model aircraft is small enough to hold in your hands, but complex enough to teach you something real about lift and drag and thrust and weight, about why the covering has to be tight and the control surfaces have to be square, and the center of gravity has to be precisely where the plan says it should be. The quality of the curriculum. Anderson understood this. And in 1982, he took the step that would define Great Plains model manufacturing's place in the history of the hobby. He designed machinery that had never before existed. Though no company before Great Plains had built equipment specifically for cutting model aircraft parts using computer-aided drafting. The interlocked construction that this machinery made possible, parts that fit together with genuine precision, that located themselves correctly relative to each other, that required no interpretation or improvisation from the builder, was a revelation. It was the difference between a curriculum that assumed prior knowledge and one that actually taught. If you want to understand what Great Plains meant to the American RC hobby in the 1980s and early 1990s, you need to hold a Great Plains kit in your hands, not the assembled model, the box. The flat, heavy, brown cardboard box that smelled of fresh balsa and the particular chemical note of the printed instruction manual. Inside that box, everything was organized. The balsa sheets were laser cut, each individual part numbered, each number corresponding to a step in the manual. Each step written by someone who had actually built the model and knew where a first-timer would hesitate. The spruce longeron strips were bundled and identified. The hardware bag contained exactly the screws and hinges and pushrod connectors the model required. The plan sheet, when you unrolled it, showed you not just what the model was supposed to look like, but why. Why the wing had this particular dihedral, why the tail moment was set at this particular dimension, why the landing gear was positioned here rather than there. This was the Great Plains standard. Other manufacturers produced kits that required you to fill in the gaps with experience you might not have. Great Plains produced kits that assumed you were willing to learn and then actually taught you. The instruction manuals were photographed in process, showing real builds in progress, real hands at real workbenches. For the person sitting down at a folding table in a garage in Peoria or Columbus or Baton Rouge, with no mentor and no prior experience and a genuine desire to learn. It was the difference between success and a pile of broken balsa. The models themselves deserve their own catalog of memory. The Big Stick was among the first a 2-meter aerobatic aircraft designed for the -size engine class, capable of torque rolls and snap rolls and the kind of vertical performance that the pattern pilots of the era were beginning to understand was possible with the right airframe. The Ultra Sport series came later and became the most recognizable Great Plains product in the company's history. The Ultra Sport 40, the Ultra Sport 60, the Ultra Sport 1000, each a variation on the theme of the perfect intermediate sport plane, capable enough for experienced pilots to explore aerobatics, tractable enough for advancing beginners to build real skill without building real craters. The Ultra Sport was what a pilot bought after the trainer and before the Warbird. It was where most of the real learning happened. The Ryan STA and the PT-19 represented the scale side of the catalog, aircraft modeled on historical originals. The Ryan Sportster of the 1930s and the Fairchild PT-19 primary trainer of World War II, built with the same precision as the sport designs, but carrying additional weight of historical connection. A man who had trained in a PT-19 at an Army Air Corps field in 1943 and was now, in 1987, building a Great Plains version of that same aircraft at his kitchen table in suburban Chicago was not merely building a model. He was doing something else. What he was doing is harder to name, but was real. If this history matters to you, if the feel of a sanding block against fresh balsa, or the smell of a glow engine warming up, or the particular weight of a just completed model balanced on your fingertips lives somewhere in your memory, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe if you haven't. Leave a like if you're watching and remembering. The algorithm that decides who sees these stories runs on engagement, and the stories themselves run on the people who remember them enough to say so. Understand Great Plains fully. You have to understand Tower Hobbies, because the two companies were intertwined from almost the beginning in ways that shaped both of them and ultimately determined the fate of each. Tower Hobbies was founded in 1971 by a Champaign man named Bruce Holsek, a year before Don Anderson founded Great Plains Model Distributors in the same city. Tower Hobbies began as a mail-order operation at a moment when mail-order retail was still conducted by catalog, a physical document mailed to customers who had asked to be on the list, containing every item the company stocked with a description and a part number and a price. By the late 1970s, the Tower Hobbies catalog had become one of the defining documents of the American RC hobby. It arrived in mailboxes across the country, thick, densely packed with photographs and specifications, a directory of everything available in the hobby. People kept their Tower Hobbies catalogs the way some people keep seed catalogs, as a record of what was possible, a document of aspiration. The Tower Hobbies catalog in its peak years was several hundred pages long, carrying engines and radios and servos and flight accessories and fuel and batteries and tools and building supplies, Great Plains kits and top flight kits and Goldberg kits, and the products of dozens of smaller manufacturers whose survival depended on the distribution network that Tower had built. For a hobby shop owner in a small town in Nebraska, or a hobbyist in rural Georgia who was hours from the nearest well-stocked hobby dealer, the Tower Hobbies catalog was the hobby. It was the connection between a person with a building board and a dream and the physical materials required to realize it. In 1985, Clint Atkins combined Great Plains Model Distributors and Tower Hobbies to form Hobbyco Incorporated. The two companies were complementary, one making and the other distributing, both operating out of the same mid-sized Illinois city, both serving the same customer base. By combining them, Atkins created something genuinely powerful, a vertically integrated hobby company that could design a product, manufacture it to a standard, and place it in front of a customer anywhere in the country through either the Tower catalog or the network of hobby shop dealers that Hobbyco maintained. The Champaign facility at 299x4 Research Road was substantial. At its peak, Hobbyco employed several hundred people in Champaign-Urbana, making it the 19th largest employer in Champaign County. Inside, the laser cutters ran on computer-aided designs that Anderson's team had developed and refined over a decade. The shipping department processed orders to hobby shops throughout North America. The customer service lines handled the questions of builders who were stuck on step 14 of the instruction manual, or whose monocoat wasn't adhering properly to the sheeted balsa, or who needed a replacement part for a kit that had been in production for 7 years. This is the version of Great Plains that the hobby community remembers. The sense that there were real people in a real place in Illinois who had thought carefully about every part of what you were building and wanted it to go well. The American RC hobby in its peak years, roughly the mid-1980s through the late 1990s, was organized around structures that seem, from the present, almost quaint in their specificity and formality. The Academy of Model Aeronautics had hundreds of thousands of members organized into chartered clubs with leased or owned flying fields, patches of mown grass at the edge of agricultural land, with a paved flight line and a frequency board where you hung your pennant when you were flying, so nobody else on your frequency would transmit. The field had a field box, a wooden case, usually homemade, carrying a glow plug igniter, fuel pump with its hand-operated priming bulb, electric starter with the 12-volt battery that powered it, spare props, spare glow plugs, field-grade CA. The ritual of a flying session at an AMA field in 1989 was specific and layered. You arrived with your model, assembled it on the flight line, fueled it using the hand pump, checked the control surface directions against the transmitter stick movements, verified that the fuel line wasn't kinking. You used the electric starter to spin the engine to life and then adjusted the needle valve, richening or leaning the mixture in small increments, listening to the engine note change, reading the exhaust smoke until the engine was running at the right temperature. Then you taxied to the end of the strip, applied throttle, and flew. These are not complicated procedures by the standards of operating real aircraft, but they required knowledge. They required the willingness to learn something, to make mistakes and understand why, to develop through practice the intuition that a skilled model pilot develops, the ability to read a model's attitude in the air from several hundred feet away and respond before conscious thought becomes available. This knowledge was transmitted at the field. The older club members taught the younger ones. The culture was, at its best, genuinely intergenerational. A place where a retired machinist and a kid just starting high school could stand on the same flight line and share the same knowledge and the same pleasure. Great Plains kits were at the center of this culture because they were what most of those people were building. When you showed up at the field with a Great Plains Ultra Sport 60 that you'd spent 3 months constructing in your basement, the other pilots knew what it was. They'd either built one themselves or flown against one or helped someone else with theirs. The kit was a common language. The hobby shops that sold Great Plains kits were the other node in this network. The independent hobby shop of the 1980s and early 1990s was a specific and now largely vanished kind of institution. A small retail space staffed by 1 or 2 people who had been in the hobby for years and whose knowledge of the product was the real inventory. You didn't go to a hobby shop only to buy things. You went to get information. You went because the guy behind the counter had flown the kit you were considering and could tell you whether the landing gear needed reinforcement and what size engine he'd recommend. The transaction was incidental to the conversation. The conversation was the point. Thousands of these shops existed across the United States in the peak years of the hobby. By 2018, a fraction of that number remained. The closing of each one was the closing of a specific kind of public space. Something like a library and a community center combined, organized around a particular human activity that the space made possible. The Aerof revolution did not arrive suddenly. It arrived the way most revolutions arrive. Gradually, then all at once, in a way that seemed obvious in retrospect and was not obvious at all while it was happening. AirRF stands for Almost Ready to Fly, a model aircraft arriving from the factory in a state of advanced completion, with the major structural work already done, the covering already applied, the control surfaces already hinged and installed. requiring from the builder only final assembly and the installation of radio and power systems. The first serious ARF products began appearing in the American market in the late 1980s and early 1990s, initially from Asian manufacturers who had understood something that the American kit manufacturers were still processing, that a significant portion of the hobby's potential customer base wanted to fly rather than build, and that the building part was, for this population, not a feature but an obstacle. Great Plains understood this as well as anyone. The ARF was in a sense the logical extension of their founding principle, taken far enough that the building itself largely disappeared. The Ultra Sport series received ARF versions. The PT-19 came as an ARF at $159. The Ryan STA arrived as an ARF sheeted in monocoat and ready for assembly in a single weekend rather than a winter. Great Plains applied the same manufacturing standards to the ARF line that had defined its kit products, and the result was aircraft that flew as well as the hand-built originals. The ARF revolution had a structural consequence that nobody fully anticipated. It decoupled the hobby from the building culture that had sustained it. The person who bought an ARF and flew it and crashed it and bought another was participating in the hobby in a real way, but they were not participating in the part that had built the community. They hadn't spent 3 months in the basement with the instruction manual. They hadn't asked for help at the hobby shop counter with the mystery of why the stabilizer wasn't seating squarely on the fuselage. They hadn't arrived at the flying field on a spring morning carrying the specific pride of a model made with their own hands. The ARF removed the barrier to entry. It also removed some of what made entry worth the effort. This story deserves more people who know it. If you've stayed with this video to this point, if the memory of a hobby shop counter or a flying field or a flat kit box on the kitchen table is real to you, hit subscribe, hit like, share this with someone who remembers. The only way to keep this history in front of people who need to hear it is to show the algorithm that it matters. And it does matter. That's the whole point. The shift of manufacturing to China was not a decision that Great Plains made in isolation. It was a decision the entire American hobby manufacturing sector faced simultaneously, driven by the same economic forces reshaping American manufacturing more broadly in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Chinese manufacturing costs for the labor-intensive wood and fabric construction that model aircraft required were substantially lower than comparable American costs. The ARF products that Chinese factories produced were, by the early 2000s, reaching a quality level that made direct comparison with American-made products uncomfortable for American manufacturers. The independent Chinese manufacturers producing ARF aircraft through online channels at 40 or 50% of the price of comparable American products were already present in the market and taking share. The Hobby King model, aggregating Chinese-made products and selling directly to hobbyists worldwide, was coming. Hobbyco's response was to do what large American hobby distributors did: source products from Chinese manufacturers and sell them under existing brand names, and maintain American operations as design and marketing functions rather than production functions. This is not a unique or dishonest strategy. It preserved the brand. It preserved some of the jobs: design, marketing, warehousing, customer service. What it did not preserve and could not preserve was the thing that Great Plains had been founded to create: an American precision manufacturing operation producing American-made model aircraft to a standard that the American hobby culture recognized and trusted. The monocoat brand survived the transition. Top Flight survived. The Tower Hobbies catalog continued to arrive, though by the mid-2000s it was also online, and the physical catalog was getting thinner as online retail changed what a printed catalog needed to do. The Great Plains name survived on products that were no longer made the way the original Great Plains products had been made. By 2017, Hobbico's revenue had fallen from $175 million to $114 million in a single year. The ESOP, the employee stock ownership plan through which the company's employees held equity, had declined in value by more than 80%. The U.S. Department of Labor had opened an investigation into deferred ESOP payments. The company carried between $100 million and $500 million in assets. The forces that had brought Hobbyco to this point were multiple and compound. The drone market, dominated entirely by DJI and a handful of Chinese manufacturers, had been missed entirely. The two, GZ race re G G big 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 G Yo. Consumer interest in traditional fixed-wing RC aircraft had been declining for years as the hobby's aging demographic aged further and youth recruitment had not kept pace. On January 10, 2018, Hobbyco Incorporated filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in federal court. The filing listed estimated liabilities of between $100 million and estimated assets of between $10 million and $50 million, and the company stated that it intended to continue operating during the bankruptcy process and to find a buyer. Letters went out to the 332 employees at the Champaign facility, notifying them, as required by the Illinois Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, that mass layoffs were possible. The news reached the hobby community through the usual channels: RC forums, hobby shop newsletters, Facebook groups populated by people who had been flying Great Plains models since the 1980s, and who received the bankruptcy news with the particular quality of grief that attaches to the loss of something that had been part of a long chapter of your life. The forum posts from January 2018 are a document of that grief, mixed with the practical anxiety of people who had standing orders with Tower Hobbies and replacement parts on back order, and relationships with customer service staff who were now facing unemployment. The grief was real. So was the practicality. The two coexisted without resolving each other. On April 13, 2018, Horizon Hobby, Hobbico's Champaign-based competitor, completed the purchase of Hobbico's RC business for $18 million. The purchase included Great Plains, Tower Hobbies, Axial, and Arma, but specifically excluded Great Plains Manufacturing. Estes Industries was acquired by the Langford family. Revell Germany went to a German venture capital group. Of the 280 Hobbico employees in the RC units that Horizon acquired, 200 applied for employment at Horizon, and 165 received offers. The Great Plains manufacturing operation, the laser cutters, the precision machinery, the capability that Don Anderson had built from nothing in 1982 was not part of what Horizon was purchasing. What survived was the name and the catalog and the customer relationships. The manufacturing standard that had built all of those things did not survive the bankruptcy. The last kit on the shelf of a hobby shop is a specific image. Not a dramatic image. There's no fire, no collapse, no visible monument to what has ended. Just a box on a shelf in a shop that is itself probably not going to be there much longer. In a strip mall surrounded by a retail landscape that has largely given up on the idea that physical stores are where things get sold. The kit is a Great Plains Ultra Sport 60. The box is a little dusty. The price tag says $149, which was the price 5 years ago and is still the price because nobody has changed it. Somebody is going to buy it eventually, or they aren't. And in either case, the world will not notice. What does it mean to lose this? Not the company. Companies fail. That is the nature of companies, but the thing the company represented. What does it mean that the primary pathway through which a generation of Americans encountered precision engineering as a pleasure, as a pastime, as something worth doing for its own sake, is now largely closed? The building of a model aircraft from a flat kit box was an education in several things simultaneously. In reading technical drawings, in understanding three-dimensional structure, from two-dimensional representation, in material properties, in the physics of control surface sizing and center of gravity. None of these things were taught as theory. They were taught as practice, as problem solving, as the consequence of getting them wrong and having to understand why. The people who came through this education did not all become engineers or machinists or pilots. Most became accountants and teachers and truck drivers and nurses. But they carried something with them from the experience that is genuinely hard to name and genuinely consequential. A willingness to engage with complexity, an understanding that precision is the respect you pay to the material you're working with and the forces it will encounter. A patience with processes that don't immediately reveal their results. The model kit was a form of practice in the original sense, a regular discipline undertaken for what it made you, not only for what it produced. The flying field was something else again. It was a place where skill was public and visible and evaluated by people who knew what skill looked like, which is the environment in which skill actually develops. The person who crashed 3 times before they stopped crashing was not only embarrassed, they were also helped, instructed, encouraged by people who had crashed before they stopped crashing and who understood this as the universal condition of the learner. The field was a school that nobody called a school, producing outcomes that showed up years later in the way a person approached any problem that required patience, precision, and the willingness to begin again after a failure. What replaced this? The digital world offered its own forms of complexity and mastery, video games that required real skill and real patience and real community, platforms that enabled self-taught expertise in almost any domain. The argument that the hands-on mechanical culture of the mid-20th century was uniquely valuable is not an argument that the present is valueless. It is an argument about a specific kind of knowledge, tactile, embodied, acquired through physical engagement with physical materials that the digital substitutes do not fully replicate. When your hands know how to read balsa, how to feel the difference between a piece that will hold a load and one that won't, how to tell by touch whether a joint is cured or still green. That knowledge lives in your hands in a way that watching a video of someone else's hands does not produce. The motor memory of a skilled craftsperson is a different kind of knowledge, and it is acquired differently, and its loss is a different kind of loss. The AMA flying fields that remain, and many remain, in the flat agricultural country of the Midwest and the open spaces of the West and the parks and fairgrounds of the East, where chartered clubs have maintained their leases, are places where this culture still lives, in reduced and aging form. The membership of the Academy of Model Aeronautics has been declining for years. The youth recruitment that the clubs and the manufacturers and the hobby shops used to accomplish through the informal networks of the hobby, through the Tower Hobbies catalog arriving in a mailbox, through the glass case of engines at the hobby shop counter, through the kid who saw a model flying at a park, no longer works the way it worked because the infrastructure through which it worked has largely dissolved. The hobby shops are mostly gone. Great Plains Model Manufacturing no longer makes models in Champaign, Illinois. The ecosystem that sustained the culture is diminished in ways that are cumulative. Fewer shops means fewer pathways to discover the hobby, which means fewer new participants, which means less revenue for manufacturers, which means fewer shops. There are people working against this. The AMA has youth development programs. Individual clubs run Learn to Fly events. The electric power revolution, lithium polymer batteries and brushless motors that appeared in the late 2000s, has lowered some barriers to participation. Simulators allow practice without crashes. The internet has made knowledge accessible in ways that the hobby shop counter, for all its irreplaceable qualities, never was. Whether these things are enough to sustain the culture that built Great Plains Model Manufacturing is a question that does not yet have an answer. The people who remember what it felt like to build something, and fly it, and fix it, and fly it again, who understand intuitively that the experience matters even when they struggle to say exactly why. Before this video ends, if you've found something in this history that resonates, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below with your memory, the first kit you built, the first field you flew at, the name of the hobby shop where someone behind the counter knew what you needed before you knew how to ask for it. The record of what this culture was and what it meant is being written right now by people like you who still carry it. Don Anderson founded Great Plains Model Distributors in 1972 because the model aircraft kits available to American hobbyists were not good enough. He spent the next decade building the machinery and the processes and the team that would make them better. The 1/5 scale Piper Cub that a retired schoolteacher in Springfield, Illinois, built over the winter of 1993 in his basement, working 2 hours each evening after dinner by the light of a workbench lamp, following the Great Plains instruction manual with the attention that the manual requested. He brought that model to the field in the spring of 1994, and it flew exactly as the manual said it would. He flew it for 11 years before it was retired to a shelf in his garage, still intact, still in its original monocoat covering, faded now to a softer version of the chrome yellow it had been when he applied it. Great Plains made that model. They made it in Champaign, Illinois, in a facility on Research Road, by people who had thought carefully about every part of the kit and what it would demand of the person who built it. They made it to a standard that the retired schoolteacher could feel in his hands when he opened the box and could confirm in the air when the model flew straight and true on its maiden flight. The facility on Research Road is still there. Buildings don't disappear. They are reassigned, repurposed, occupied by whatever the next chapter requires of the space. The laser cutters are gone. The manufacturing operation is gone. The 332 employees who were warned of possible layoff found their way to other employment. The Tower Hobbies name continues under Horizon Hobby. The Great Plains name appears on products that are no longer made in Champaign. What is gone is harder to point to. It is the specific relationship between a manufacturer and a community. The sense that somewhere in a flat Illinois city, a group of people who were also hobbyists were thinking about your problem, designing a kit that would teach you something, writing an instruction manual that would not abandon you at step 14. The sense that the hobby was being tended by people who understood what it was for. That relationship took decades to build. It ended with a Chapter 11 filing in January 2018, and nothing has replaced it. There is a field, somewhere in central Illinois, or in southern Ohio, or in the Sacramento Valley, where a few people are still flying on a Saturday morning. Some are flying aircraft they built from kits. Some are flying aircraft that arrived from a warehouse overseas. All of them are watching something rise into the air against a sky that is the same color it has always been. And whatever they feel watching it is real. And it matters. Leave your memory in the comments. Whatever field, whatever kit, whatever shop, whatever Saturday morning. The record of this culture is still being made right now by you. Share,